Welcome to the IISS, everyone. My name is Matthew Harries. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute and managing editor of our journal, Survival. I think no one in this room probably needs telling that now is a very uncertain moment for the future of transatlantic relations, partly in parochial terms because of the Brexit vote, partly in parochial terms across the Atlantic because of the elections, but more broadly because of the strategic currents we've seen in the last few years. And because of that, it's a great pleasure to welcome an extremely well-qualified speaker to the Institute to talk to us today. Dr. Jackson Jaynes is president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I think is well known as an expert on US-German relations and transatlantic relations more broadly. He has been at the AICGS since 1989. He's also the recipient of the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. And even more importantly, he's a long-standing member of the IISS.
Right.
So it's with great pleasure that I introduce him as our speaker today. He'll speak for 20 or so minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So take it away, Jack.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. I was speaking this morning with Tony Barber, who many of you know from the Financial Times, and we were wondering which country is in more or worse shape, the UK or the United States at this point. Maybe it's a toss-up.
What did he say?
No comment. Anyway, I wanted just to share with you something that literally just reached my desk yesterday. I have a good friend of mine who runs the representative of the Deutsche Bank in Washington, D.C., and he puts together really good assessments of where things are. And he shared this with me, and I said I was going to be here, and he said, please, if they're interested, use it if you'd like. So I'm going to use it. We, in fact, at AICGS did not produce this, but we are working on this stuff. The Institute, just briefly, is a think tank like any other in Washington, D.C. We've been around since '83, and our work is essentially about four things: challenges and choices that Germany and the United States face, the consequences of the choices, and we draw conclusions. So that's our modus operandi. And basically, we're right now in the middle of looking at our situation in the States as it impacts on Europe and to some extent the perceptions in Europe of what we're facing in the United States. But of course, I keep telling my Germans when we're finished looking at our circus, we're going to turn to your circus next year when you have your own elections, including the French next door. So let me briefly go through where I think we stand at this point on the elections. And of course, tonight, if all of you are going to spend the night watching television, you may see something interesting. Normally, debates are entertainment. They're not necessarily informative. In this year, of the elections being held not here, but down here, I hope that Hillary doesn't have a coughing spell. We will see how she deals with the fraudulent statements from Mr. Trump and the moderator himself. But it is an ugly scene, and I don't mean to make any lipstick on a pig depiction other than that. We will see what happens tonight, and there are more coming, as you know. Let me start out by simply giving you a few things to chew on, and then we'll get into a discussion about this if you'd like, okay? This is a breakdown of the basic sociology of the United States of America. You can see one particular figure that jumps out at you: 88 million eligible voters who chose not to vote, even in general elections. That means that there's a lot of slide, possibly on November 8th, as to who is going to turn out and who is not going to turn out. As you can see below that, 73 million people did not vote in the 2016 primaries. That's important to keep in mind because Mr. Trump got 15 million votes, which put him over the primary stage, but that's not the expected 140 to 150 million votes that could be cast somewhere between now and November 8th. You can see below that 13 million, sorry I got that name, 13 million voted for Trump, 17 million voted for Clinton. Those are the primaries, those are the people that are mostly motivated, those are the people that are most active. So the question is, what happens to the great group between that. Okay, so that's where we start in terms of looking at where our status is of people who are actually going to vote in the polls. This is a relatively complicated graph, but let me just point at a few things. First of all, we do not have a national election. We have 50 elections, 50 state elections. It's important to remember that because of the first figure you see, 270. That is the number of electoral college votes that one needs to get to the White House, plus one. And we see at this point, or at least this analysis shows that in the case of Clinton, there seems to be at least a projection here of the 270, she may have as many as 242. This is something that is referred to as the blue wall, the 18 states which have usually voted Democratic. So I'm talking about Illinois, I'm talking about California, New York, and a lot of states on either coast. So that means that to some extent, a lot of votes that she might be able to start out with in terms of the Electoral College before the election even takes place, based on previous experience. There are 174 so-called toss-up states. Even if we were to say that Mr. Trump had a chance of winning, you can see where it says 102, that the 13 states would have constantly voted Republican, only give him 102, so that it would be a question mark as to whether the toss-up states would give him those votes that he needs to get above 270. I'm not going to really go into too many more of those. I can come back to that if you'd like, only to say that there's a lot of flexibility in here in terms of looking at who has what group in mind. Women tend to vote more than men in the United States. Afro-Americans tend to vote more than other ethnic groups. The percentages of whites, and you'll see this in the next graph, I think. Let me just get down here. Let me just go back here for a minute. So this is essentially one of the projections that they're making. Clinton should win based upon the figures that I just gave you. She is pretty close to that 270 even before the election gets started. But of course it's not a particular nailed down victory in any way, shape, or form. You can see three results there. Democrats take the Senate, Republicans keep the House, divided government. You can have a second Clinton victory, but the Republicans stay in control of both chambers of the House and the Senate, which I think is what's going to happen. Or you can have a sweep. In the White House, the Republicans have the majorities on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Very difficult to say, but as you can see, numbers that he's using here, that is probably less likely. This is an occasion to say, are there really any differences in terms of the policy, the candidates themselves? There is, on the trade and economy side, an astounding overlap with Clinton and Trump because they both are very critical of both TTIP and TPP, as you know. A couple differences do occur, but they both, interestingly enough, want to spend a lot of money. It makes Clinton and Trump, or shall we say Trump, less of a conservative Republican than his predecessors are. And that's why a lot of Republicans do not treat him as a conservative. I won't go into too much detail about industry specific, but clearly one of the things that you will see there for business purposes that there is an effort to deal with climate, which is something that on the Republican side is not particularly popular. I'll skip over this. This is essentially some of the policy differences between the two, but it's a little granular, so I don't think we necessarily have to go into that. And the same thing here. Obviously, Trump is going to want to dismantle Dodd-Frank, want to dismantle Obamacare. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are some differences, but it's very difficult to say what happens to a president once that president is in office and what kind of Congress they have to deal with. So if you say crack down on 11.3 million illegal immigrants, doesn't mean you can do it, because the Congress still has a great deal to say about that. I'll skip over this for a minute and go into foreign policy. Here you have clearly, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it, which is really nonsense, but that's something that he's selling for deporting aliens. And then the only other one is building up a nuclear arsenal on the Trump side. And obviously both of them agree that they have to root out and destroy ISIS, but they don't really know how to do that. Okay, so let me go into here. Now this gives you a more interesting question to keep in mind if you actually do watch this debate tonight and follow things over the next 45 days. You see how in the elections, the last 4 elections, how people won and lost. Bush defeats Gore in 2000 by winning 271 electoral votes. You know how that happened. That was a Supreme Court decision that stopped the voting in Florida, and therefore Florida pushed Bush over the 270 mark. In 2004, Bush defeats John Kerry with 286 electoral college votes. All right, so that's only 15 more over that 270 mark. It wasn't a landslide at all. In 2008, Obama defeats McCain. He has 365 electoral college votes. That's a landslide. That's a fairly decisive win. And if you look at the states that he won on either coast, this is the key to getting Mrs. Clinton elected. You'll see Pennsylvania and Ohio there. Those are key states to win if she is going to get above that 270 marks. But that's the way Obama did it in 2008. In 2012, he had similar states. However, he lost Virginia, North Carolina, as you can see down there in the south. It's a question mark, though, because whether North Carolina, given what's going on there at the moment in terms of racial relations, and those states, how they will play. But those blue states in 2008 and 2012 are the key for Hillary to win on November 8th. And she's looking to make that formula win for her again. This is the map favoring Democrats, the so-called red and blue walls. This is what I was talking about before. The blue wall is the 242 electoral votes. 18 states have voted Democrat in the past 6 elections, so that one would lend itself to saying they'll vote again blue. Leaning Dem in 2006, electoral votes, 16 states. And then the toss-up, as I mentioned before, which conceivably could put Mr. Trump over the 270 mark. The red states, you can see, run right smack down through the middle of the country. And a few of the red states in this deep south and to the west. But interestingly enough, those states up there in North Dakota and South Dakota, they don't have a lot of electoral college votes because, apologies to anybody who comes from those 2 states, nobody lives there. And so there's really no particular weight in terms of electoral college votes in comparison to California or New York or Pennsylvania. That's where the most of the population of the country is. Texas is a big enchilada, if we can put it that way. But the major thing is, can she hold on to those 242 and add then another 30 and get over the 270 mark? Electoral college math, again, same thing. 270 to win. You can see the breakdown there in terms of what it is that lead people to think that she has a lot of states, at least on her side of the column. We'll see where things go. And then you have the toss-ups in the middle. Pennsylvania, again, is always important to keep in mind here because it's a big state and has a lot of votes in it. But it's usually gone Democratic over the last few elections. The safe GOPs, you can see on the right there, are fairly predictable in terms of their votes. But look at the numbers according to each state. The numbers of electoral college votes. They're not very many. Okay. The path to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue goes through Pennsylvania, as I said. So you have the blue wall, you have the must-win Pennsylvania, and the also needs. Florida, by the way, would have a lot of people that would come from the Hispanic circle, and that would be the question, are the Hispanics going to go en masse and vote for Hillary like the Afro-Americans are predicted to do? The red wall, of course, that then does include the fact that to get beyond what he has, at 164. He needs Florida, he needs Pennsylvania, and he needs Ohio, and some combo of some other states which remain uncertain at this point. These are the large battleground states divided up in a different way, but it just goes to show you that when you say battleground, we don't know which way those states are going to go, but they have gone, in many cases, to Democrats in the past, particularly Pennsylvania, Virginia, and on occasion Ohio. New Democratic Party vulnerables. These are the states that are not necessarily in the pocket of Mrs. Clinton, or the new Republican Party vulnerables not in the pocket of the Republican Trump candidate. We'll have to see how that goes. John McCain, you probably all know, comes from Arizona, the Senator McCain. He had a really tough time winning his election, his primary out there recently, and it just goes to show you that there is something called the down ballot impact of Donald Trump. The down ballot meaning what happens to the Senate and the House candidates that are trying to get reelected or elected, and the impact of Donald Trump's campaign on them. Down ballot simply means, is it a good impact or is it a bad impact? And there are some people that think that the McCain problem in Arizona had a lot to do with McCain not demonstrably sorting Mr. Trump, but also saying, I will support the Republican candidate, whether that was not particularly advantageous for him. So these are the sort of imponderables at this point, as I say, 45 days out. These are the third-party candidates. There are two. One is a Green, and one is a Libertarian. Some of you might remember Ralph Nader in 2000, who got some votes, and some people argue that he helped Gore lose the election. I'm not sure that's really actually true, but these guys will pick up some percentage of the votes. We don't know how much. And the question is, what will that do to a certain key state, as you can see, in which those parties might subtract votes from either Clinton, possibly from Trump, the Libertarians picking up from Trump, the Greens picking up from the Clinton group. So we'll have to see how that works out, but it's not particularly clear as to how important they will be. But they are running, and they will be registered on November 8th. Shifting demographics is interesting insofar as looking at the racial picture of the United States in 2016. You can see the difference between the percentage of white voters in 2016 compared to what it was in 92. Education ratios change and age ratios change because of the demographic bubble going through. So what that says about what it is that's going to happen, according to what each of those groups is going to vote for, is only speculation at this point. But we do know that the demographic picture of the United States is changing, and it would probably stand to reason that, given the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, that a good deal of people on the Hispanic side of the fence will vote for Mrs. Clinton, or certainly the Afro-American group will as well, in a large number. The question is, will that be enough? And then, of course, on the age bracket, we will see where this particular group goes. That is to say, those between 18 and 29, the so-called millennials. They were big on Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is now running around trying to change their minds and tell them they must vote against Trump and therefore for Hillary. That's not a good sales mechanism. You know, don't rent from Hertz, they're bad. Rent from Avis, they're better. Don't vote for Trump, he's bad. Vote for Hillary, he's bad. That's not exactly an enthusiastic message, but that's what he's got to sell. So we'll see where the millennials go. That could be a fairly important group because it was a very important group for Obama. Election turnout is the key issue. Who's going to vote? How many people will actually vote? And we can see here by ethnicity what the election turnout was in 2012. Large number of Afro-Americans vote. You can see the numbers of the Hispanic, and of course the Asian shouldn't be discounted here. That's a big group. And females voting more, and one wonders whether or not some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign will motivate women to vote in a certain direction, more so this time around than the last time. And then, of course, you have this breakdown of the millennial vote, you can see what I say at the bottom there was 46% of the millennials. People at younger ages don't tend to vote as much as the people who are older. Where will that go? How will that turn out? We'll have to wait and see on that, but that's a big factor. But let me just leave you with a reminder that the female vote is extremely important, and we will see where that winds up. Obviously, you don't have to hear this repeated too much. We've got a really polarized situation in the party system. The Democrats have moved left. The Republicans have moved right. It's not clear how much of those activists on either side of that spectrum can motivate others to vote in their direction. This widening ideological gap, I should say, is a national phenomena. If you go out to the state level or to the city level, you have a lot more practical cooperation across party lines. Where the problem is my hometown, Washington, D.C., and that is an issue that we've seen time and time again, really almost going back 25 years. So we've got a big problem in terms of ideological clashes, but that really then leaves the question, who do you motivate to go to the polls by virtue of your ideological passions? And we will see that play a role on November 8th. The funding advantage, people talk about this. Money is, of course, bottomless in the U.S. campaign. It's something that we are unable to put a harness on, and you can see how much is involved here. It was also the case with Obama, so there's no real buddy with clean white vests here on, but money is a huge factor here as far as advertisements are concerned, TV and things of that sort. But as you can see, it seems like it's a bottomless pit. And then, of course, a lot of them, the Democrats have had what they call a ground game, which means they've been all over the country for many, many months now, and the Republicans have not been. Why? Because they had this huge battle as to who was going to get the nomination, with the 16 to 17 people that were fighting it out. And as a result, they didn't get into the process. There was never a doubt that Hillary was going to get the nomination for the most part. But in that case, with such civil war going on within the party, they didn't get a ground game going so quickly in the Republican field. So it's hard to know whether that will come to the disadvantage of the Republicans at the end of the game or not. Here are the big states that you should look at: Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. It's always those states that are critical to where the election will turn out. You can see how the percentages now look in terms of demographics in those states, but my sense is that a lot of the national polls are irrelevant, because at this point a lot can happen between now and November 8th. There are 3 debates and there is 1 vice presidential debate, so these numbers can fluctuate, but those are the big states that are going to be the key battleground states. Popular vote likely to be close. That's not unusual. It's not unusual to have a very close popular vote. 56, 44, 48, 52. This is not an unusual situation, but don't pay attention to that. What's important is the Electoral College votes in each state. And at the end of the day, however, I want to just open up a parenthesis here. And now I'm going to show my political colors. The poison that has been pumped into the American electorate in the context of this very ugly campaign is not going to go away on November 8th. And it's going to seep into the Congress. And there's going to be battle royals on either end of the Pennsylvania Avenue. I'll tell you that the basic problem will be that if the Congress remains Republican, which I think it will, then you will probably have a battle royal with the White House like you've seen for the last 8 years. I would say that the Republican attitude toward Clinton in some pockets, not all of them, is likely to hate her more than they hated Obama. And the rationale for me saying that is simply because she's been around for 35 years. And she had a husband who was also in the White House. So there's a lot of unfortunate gridlock looming after this election is over. If the Republicans are in charge of the Congress and Hillary is in the White House, it's no guarantee for kumbaya. This is a reflection of the fact that both of the Democratic conventions and Republican conventions are supposed to give a bump after they're over. That didn't really matter too much. As you can tell from the polls as of today, it's very, very close on the national polling level. But again, don't pay attention to that right now. It's too early. You've got a lot of people that are going to talk about this tomorrow morning after the debate's over, trust and temperament. There's clearly divisions that represent the politicalization and the polarization, who's got more trust, who's got more temperament. The fact that Hillary has been taken apart for her emails and for Benghazi has less to do with those two issues. It's more the fact that Hillary has been in the public eye for 30, 40 years, and she's got a lot of bullseyes pasted on her back. This is the problem if you stay in power, or you are in the public eye for a long time. You can't avoid it. Trump has been around for 35 years and more when you think about it, but he's never been in public office. But he has been and will have more experience behind a television camera than any other candidate in the history of the United States. And if I can just open up a parenthesis here, why is he so popular? And I think that the reason is in some circles, and there are certain demographic circles, he represents what they would like to be. They'd like to have a plane, they'd like to have a lot of money, they'd like to have a building named after, they'd like to have a beautiful family, they'd like to have all of that, and most of all, they would like to be able to say to somebody who's their boss, "You're fired." And that is what the problem is, that a lot of people see in him that they haven't seen in public office. They don't have no track record with him. They can't even see his income tax returns. But he'll burn the house down. And that's good enough for some people. So you have this kind of, this makeup here of what are the individual issues on which people will make up their minds. I think that's really granular. Will people be particularly focused on health care? Will they be particularly focused on wise foreign policy decisions? I don't know. But this is the spread in which people find themselves talking about the candidates and how they would handle certain interests. Now, tonight, as you can look at that number 18 and see notable debate gaffes, what that really kind of says is that there have been mistakes made by a candidate in the middle of this debate series, which people then go back to and say, boy, if he hadn't said that or she hadn't said that, of course we've never had a woman candidate before, but if he hadn't said that, maybe then they would have won. I don't think that that's necessarily true, because 80% of the American public has probably made up their minds right now. But the fact of the matter is, in this particular case, he's looking at the Bush gaffes that might have impacted a few percentages of the voters based on impressions only. One example, Mr. Bush in 1988, or was it in 1992, when he was running against Clinton. Bush was in the middle of a campaign. There were three people up there on the stage. There was Clinton, there was Ross Perot. Anybody remember him? And there was George Herbert Walker Bush, one of the finest polished political policy experts that's ever been put in the White House, and he had one term. Why did he have one term? Because he was the third term of Ronald Reagan and coasted on Ronald Reagan's popularity. And then why did he have one term? Because that time, at that debate, at one point, for 10 seconds, he looked at his watch. And there were a lot of people that said, oh, he's not really interested. And that's the impression that can make a difference, but it's not particularly going to make the difference in the end. It's just that it's impression. Again, who's going to vote? Is this polarization going to lead to more people than usual? We don't know, but we will see. Gender divide again. Look at where Clinton is versus Trump on the female vote. That's a big factor, and we will find out what that means at the end of the day after November 8th. Here's age differences, but again, I think that, remember, she's 69, he's 70. All right, so some people ask me the questions, and they'll say, hey, Jack, come on, couldn't you do any better than these two? Couldn't you find better candidates than these two people? Well, that's a good question, and one of the questions that have to be raised is, how did Trump slaughter candidates that were standing next to him, and how did Hillary wind up with a lock on this before it even got started? It's a different question for the parties to answer. But that's what we got, and that's what we will see. I think I'll probably just skip over the fact, what I've said before, ethnicity and race. We know where some of the ethnic groups are going to turn out. Look at the Clinton popularity poll on the Afro-American vote versus Trump. So I think it's really a toss-up as to which way the white vote goes, but on the black, on the Afro-American vote, and then probably on the Hispanic vote, it's probably pretty clear that she's going to get the majority of those votes. Education and income, it seems to think that people with more education is going to get more votes for Clinton than for Trump. We'll see how that works out. These are projections. The vice presidential candidate normally plays no role whatsoever, except if you have somebody like Sarah Palin, which helps to lose the election. But in this particular case, I'm not sure that it's going to help in this case because Tim Kaine is relatively unknown. One reason he is the vice presidential candidate, and one reason only. He represents a state with 13 electoral college votes. So Tim Kaine might be helpful to get Virginia, which is useful to get to 270. Okay? I'm going to stop there because there's some implications, but we can talk about that. But let me just end by saying that I think that Hillary's going to win this election by somewhere between 290 and 315 electoral college votes. The work that she will have to create a bridge across Pennsylvania Avenue begins on November 9th. And all I can say is good luck with that. Anyway, that's where we stand.
Great. Jack, thank you very much. That was an excellent data-driven dive into what's going to happen. And I'm glad you ended with a prediction because I sat, and I think a lot of people here sat in a lot of meetings before the EU referendum, which didn't spend enough time talking about what would happen if the UK voted to leave. So I want to ask you a first question about President Trump. Mm-hmm. What is a Trump foreign policy going to look like? And from a European perspective, we've heard Trump talk a little bit about NATO, and not in a favourable sense. What should Europeans expect from a hypothetical Trump presidency?
It's very difficult to say that. I can only base on the principle that having 28 years of work in Washington, D.C. in the foreign policy community, I have no idea who he is talking to. I have no idea who's advising him. The names that I see that are in that circle are unknown to me. Okay, so as a result, for us to explicate from that what Trump is thinking about foreign policy issues is extremely difficult, to put it mildly. That said, I believe that Trump will be a president who wants to be a domestic president, very much like Bush did in 2000, before 9/11. Bush was not a foreign policy expert by any shape, form, or measurement. And nor did I think that he expected to be. That he wanted to come in and be a president of the United States of America and then have Dick Cheney run the foreign policy apparatus, which is why he chose him for for vice president. He has chosen a governor of Indiana, Mr. Pence, to be his vice presidential running mate, who knows, shall we say, well, by definition, he has to know more than Mr. Trump about foreign policy. But the fact of the matter is that I think that what we will have to measure that by, and we can only do it after the fact, is saying, what will he be interested in? What will he be interested in? I think that the trade issues will push him. I think that there'll probably this promise that he can deal tougher with the Chinese, deal with getting our jobs back in the country, that whole economic sphere, which is really where he spent most of his professional life, will drive his policy. So the question will be, who will be the head of the United States Trade Rep? Who will be the Secretary of State? Who will be Defense Secretary? We will probably see him outsource a lot of his policy decisions to his cabinet, whoever that will be, because his experience and knowledge of these issues is very limited. So what I would expect you to see is a CEO-type mentality, anointing vice CEOs to say, you go do that, and you tell me what you want to do, and I'll say yay or nay. But you're not going to see a George Herbert Walker Bush. You're not going to see someone who's quite deeply involved in foreign policy come in there and know how to make decisions. Admittedly, Obama, when he became president in 2008, also didn't have a lot of experience on the foreign policy front, certainly not in Europe. But he was able to put Hillary Clinton in the State Department and a few other people that were well-known people, and I think that's what we would look to. The problem is that I think that he's made a lot of promises to the American public. They're going to bring our jobs back. You know, Detroit is going to look like it did in 1967. That's not going to happen. I mean, this is not going to be easy for him any more than building a wall on the Mexican border is going to take place. So there's going to be a lot of damage control in areas in which he has tried to say that I'm going to do this, I'll fix this. And so I think a lot of it, to answer your question, is going to be dependent upon who is going to be nominated, who's willing to work with him, who is willing to take the job. You know that there have been a lot of people in the United States, Republicans, who have en masse signed a statement saying they're not going to vote for this guy. And these are really important, very experienced people like Bob Zellick, who I'm sure has been here, and others. So it's very difficult to know how to answer that question. But I think that basically, were I to make in any way, shape, or form, a comparison, I would say think about the way George W. Bush came in 2000. He was governor of the state of Texas. He had not a lot of experience in foreign policy, and he had a person who had been Secretary of Defense, knows the foreign policy establishment, and basically outsourced it to him. I think that's what's going to happen.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes for discussion. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and please introduce yourself at the start so we know who you are, and we'll take these in clusters of 2 or 3.
Absolutely.
Okay, who's first? Yes.
My name is Lindsay Iverson. I work at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, also an office in Washington. Thank you very much for your talk. I'd like you to add, if you can, a little bit about the European side. So one of the things that has sort of continually struck me about the European Union institution is that they're consistently looking 20 years in the future instead of at the problems in front of them right now. So during the Greek crisis, I attended a talk where there was a senior EU official who was talking about fiscal integration in Europe, and I saw a story in the New York Times a week or so ago about a common EU foreign policy and a common EU military, in the weeks immediately after the Brexit vote, and sort of adverse electoral consequences in Germany and elsewhere. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think Europe will handle either of these precedents. I think if Hillary is elected president, she'll expect more of Europe. I think Trump has made his views as clear as he can on what more he'll expect from Europe. So how do you think Europe will address that? Are they capable of doing it? What do they need to do?
Well, first of all, I think, as a CFR member, by the way, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think that there is going to be, on the Hillary Clinton side of the win, let's say she is the president, not any confrontation like we've heard from Mr. Trump about whether or not, Estonia has paid their bills before we defend them on their border from the Russian threat. But I do think that there's going to be, as there is in general, and you probably know this cyclical debate in the United States about how much we can be our world global policeman. That's, I think, something that is nothing new. We've had it really for now and then. Sestanovich wrote a book about this. Basically, we are in a cycle now where the U.S. is exhausted, the American people are exhausted. We have 15 years of 2 wars. We've been, at a heightened sense of vulnerability since 2001. And there's a lot of people that are saying, why are we building schools in Kabul and not in Detroit? Now, having said that, I think that Hillary Clinton's knowledge and exposure to the European Union will lead her to ask critical questions about what are you willing to handle in terms of dealing with the continuing crisis in Ukraine, the situation in Iran, the context of Syria. All of those things, I think she would go at them and say, what can you do? I think you're right about the fact that, the European Union is in a funk at the moment. And I think the question mark is going to be, what can they do to organize themselves to deal with immediate problems that can be shared with us, can be burden shared, the old burden shared argument. But she's going to want to do that because of the fact that she has a population at home which is saying, why do we have to do everything? And there's been a number of occasions where the NATO discussion has come up and we're paying 70% of the bill and why aren't the Europeans doing more? I think that she'd be more capable of asking the question, well, let's not just talk about metrics of money. Let's talk about metrics of capabilities. And what came out of Bratislava, I think that's what you were talking about. We've heard that before, going back to 1991 and the French-German Brigade. I mean, this has been a long chat with the Europeans. I was quite critical of that because I felt there's no reason for you to think about putting your own act together because you're scared to death by Donald Trump. You've got to do this in your own interest. But I think that she will have it in mind to talk with the Europeans about what it is that they can handle while we are dealing with the South China Sea, where they can't do a thing. On the Trump side, I don't have a clue. I mean, I think that basically there is this sense that America has to be great again. That goes against the grain of what I just said about Americans thinking, now, wait a minute, we don't have to do everything. He doesn't really have much to say about that. So I think that there is going to be a tectonic shift over the next 8 years in the sense that the U.S. is and you all know about this thing about the pivot to Asia. And I think that there's going to be continuation of that pivot in the sense of looking at not only economic opportunities but also military threats. And so how do we deal with that where the Europeans are not present? What does Europe do about North Korea? So I think we have to kind of sort out where we can say we have to take care of this more, you have to take care of that more, and how can we respect each other in terms of trying to find out a new equation of burden and power sharing. She could carry on that discussion quite evenly if there's readiness on this side of the Atlantic to have it. And I worried, we were talking about that before, we worry about that a little bit because of the centrifugal forces that are pushing at or pulling at the European fabric. This is why we're at the institute that I direct, where we focus a lot on German-American affairs. We're particularly concerned about 2 elections next year, one in Germany and one in France. And, we're concerned about the UK as well, but I think that to some extent we're really concerned about what happens in Berlin, because if Merkel decides to leave the helm of the ship, there's no one to take her place. And I think that's the problem that a lot of European people may be thinking about, even if they do it with gnashed teeth and are mad at her for the immigration issue or for the Greek debacle with the euro. That all said, my sense is that regardless of who wins, I think that's where you were going, we're going to have a new discussion with Europe about capabilities and about choices to meet them. And that's something I think could be done without necessarily having a insulting conversation about it. I hope.
Yes, in front row.
Hi, my name is Maria Javid. I'm a research assistant at the University of Westminster. I just wanted to ask, how do you see the special relationship changing between the US and the UK if either Trump or Clinton comes into power? Do you see it changing? What's the comparison?
Well, I don't think he'll be welcome in Scotland often. I mean, I think that countries and politicians are pretty professional on the whole, and they would probably figure out a way to deal with him if Trump was elected. But I think that in terms of the interests of the United States, as far as that goes, we have this huge investment in Europe. We also have a huge investment in the UK. So there's singular parallel stakes involved. And I think that, Obama came to London, gave a speech, and said, don't do this. And that didn't go very far. So I think that to some extent the issue is more, how do we deal with what you in the UK, and Tony Barber was saying that this negotiation with the EU could go on for years. what do we do with the European Union that's having this negotiation with a moving target called the United Kingdom, while we need the EU, and there's a German word that I often use here, handlungsfähig, in other words, the ability to act, the ability to really, deliver on promises. How do they do that if they are hamstrung with this particular problem that they don't know how to solve because no one has ever done it before? And so I think what you would find, again, to get back to Trump, is that we don't know who he's going to put in charge of those things, and we have no idea what his role would be. But in either case, I would say that it's like the old expression, nations don't have permanent friends, they have permanent interests. And I think that we will have permanent interests in the UK and in the European Union. How you two piece this puzzle together is going to be very difficult for us. Let me give you one example. A friend of mine is the head of the stock exchange in Frankfurt. He initiated a merger with FTSE. Well, let's see how that plays out now. And if that plays out, if it actually happens, then that would be something that I think on the case of the U.S., we'd probably say, well, that's good in the sense that there's still communication across the channel. But I think that the worry that you will find in either administration would be, is Europe beginning to unwind? And if it's going to be unwinding because of the euro or because of this Brexit or because of other things, the contagious disease of a Brexit, that's not good news for us, no matter who's in the White House or who's in the Congress. I would remind you, by the way, that there's a wonderful speech that I think was a great speech that Obama gave in Hanover at the Hanover Fair, which basically laid out what I just said. And it would be good to know that that could be read somewhere.
Yes, sir.
My name is Akshay. I'm a postgraduate student at King's. I was just wondering that if Trump wins or loses the election, what do you think will be the future of the Republican Party? Do you think they'll sort of produce more Trump 2.0s and go more right, or do you think that they'll try to center themselves and appeal to both their national and international audience?
One would think the latter. One would hope the latter. One would wish the latter. I think that basically I'm going to use the expression again I used before, the poison that he has and managed to hijack the party with will be in a situation where the damage that he's done will have to be picked up by someone. What Trump is going to do when he loses, he's going to return to his business. He's going to sit around in his hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue that he just opened and go like this to either end of Pennsylvania Avenue and write a book. But the problem will be that some person has to pick up the pieces. That could be a Paul Ryan, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It could be a wannabe person that want to be running in 2020 against Hillary Clinton. I don't know who that is right now. And they thought they were going to restructure and rethink their strategy in 2012 after Romney lost, and they didn't. And so they now got themselves 4 years later facing the same problems that they are going to have in the next 4 years. The Republicans that I know say they were hoping that don't like Trump, they never Trump people. They said it'd be great if he could lose significantly, and then they could use that as an example to say, now we got to clean up and figure out how we start again. But the party is so fragmented at this point, and there's such a division between the voters, shall we say, the people that want to burn the house down, and the people who have been in the establishment of the Republican Party. There's such a divide between those two groups that it's very difficult to know who would have the charisma, who would have the capacity to say, okay, let's go and rethink what we are as a party. Are we a conservative party? What is it that we represent? I don't know. I don't think they know. And I think that the question will be what happens in the Congress, because if the Congress becomes very polarized after this election is over, with some of the people who wanted to have Trump win still making a lot of noises in that particular platform, that's going to be very difficult for anybody to round up a consensus within the party as to what it is. Now, parties, I don't have to tell you all, are having trouble across Europe as well as in the United States. They're trying to redefine themselves. The CDU has lost 500,000 members in Germany over the last 20 years. The SPD has lost a lot of voters. Obviously, your parties are having trouble, and so are ours. And so I think that a lot of the problems are basically a divide between, the elites and the peasants. And so my sense is that anyone who's going to redefine the Republican Party, somewhat like Reagan did in 1980 when he had 8 years to do it in the White House, is going to have to show up on the screen, on the horizon somewhere. I don't know who that is. It could be somebody from a governor's mansion somewhere out there in the country. Think John Kasich, or the governor of New Mexico, or the governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley. But there has to be a whole new face on the party, because right now that face is one guy with a really bad haircut.
Yes, at the back, sir.
Oliver Brown, PwC. To what extent do you think that President Clinton would be more assertive in relations with China and Russia than Obama's tended to take quite a long view, be fairly sort of standoffish? Do you think Clinton would change that?
Let's take two at a time. Yes, please.
Yes. My name is Bruce George. I was a member of Parliament for 36 years. I've never seen my country, Europe, or yours, in such a mess.
I agree.
Why should it all seem to coalesce at the same time? I wish I hadn't come. I was frightened before I came here. I'm absolutely terrified now at the world being potentially ruled by so many total bloody idiots. Why has it come about all at the same time?
Which one do you want to take first?
Let's leave existential crisis.
I like the question. I mean, if I could just go back to our, is it PwC back there? I was thinking about, how she would have to handle relationships with those countries based upon the same problem that Obama had. You can't have a treaty without a Senate. You can't have an aggressive foreign policy that involves maybe military action without having some support from the Congress in general and the people at large. So the test for Hillary may not be China as a way that Trump has portrayed China. It may be pushing them to deal with North Korea. It may be pushing them, to deal with problems that she can identify as something that we share. My sense is that the agenda that Obama faces right now and has for the last 4 to 8 years will be the same for her anyway. The world doesn't change in an instant on November 8th. And so we'll have an aggressive, Moscow-oriented mafia government. We're going to have to deal with a country that is our banker, China. We have to deal with the fires that are out there in the Middle East, and in, I think, North Korea is extremely dangerous. And so I think what she will probably wind up doing is trying to get out of what has been assigned to Obama as, the long-term president, the long-term thinking. We don't have to be everywhere where we need to be, but try to assign or to identify problems in which we have a common stake. That's difficult. I'm not sure exactly whether Trump knows what he's talking about when he says, I will be tougher on the Chinese. I don't think he knows how to do that. But I do think that basically the issue is going to be, how do you assign alliances with certain countries that are going to help bring China around to the thinking that, yeah, they can build an air base and they can build rocks together in the middle of the South China Sea, but that doesn't bring them more advantages in the long run. Her rhetoric may be different. Her rhetoric may be different from Obama's, but I don't think that the Hillary presidency, to be honest with you, will be that much different from Obama's. But I do think that the identification of the problems that we face will require her to say to other countries, what are you going to help us do with this problem, as opposed to simply being standoffish, as Obama to some extent has slightly been. But one of the things that always is a problem for any president is an externality, as we say. So in the case of George W. Bush, it was 9/11. And in the case of Obama, it was the recession, and then it was a number of other things that happened in the meantime. She will react to that. But I would say that one of the things that both of them would have to do, regardless of who's president, but certainly in her case, she'd have to figure out how to derive and create a consensus in the country that this pullback, this isolationist trend that has now grabbed hold of us, can be somehow controlled. Because she has postured on TPP, she's postured on TTIP for reasons to get herself elected, when she knows full well that it's important to have these trade agreements. So she's going to have to reshape the consensus in the country that seems to be saying, we've had enough. We don't have to do everything. How come we have to put out all these fires? And somehow or another, she's going to have to figure out a way to regenerate the sense of purpose that the country's had for the last 7 decades. And that's going to be a real challenge. I don't think Trump knows how to do that. I think she does. But it's going to be challenging. Yeah, there are a lot of idiots around. I mean, I think that basically we've been here before, though. And we paid a big price for that. Why now? Why now? I think one of the interesting issues, I think, in the United States, I won't speak for the UK, you know more about that than I do, but in the Republican Party, for example, really ever since 1970, ever since Nixon, the Republicans have been saying to their supporters, we're going to cut back government. We're going to make government small. We're going to be strong. We're going to do all of these things that are going to make the economy hum. And they did deliver. And so as a result, when Trump comes along, he can attack the very people that he says he represents and say they were not credible because they kept saying they would do something and they did nothing of the sort. And so there are problems with people who are then saying, well, then the solution is you burn the house down. Because there's no way that the current structure can be changed. It's like a big tanker. It can only move a couple inches. And the impatience with the country, the opportunism of Nigel Farage and others, and people like Trump and others that are saying, I'll fix it. It appeals to people. You know, you can take a big hammer. Everything looks like a nail. Boom, I'll fix it. And I think that's the problem with the current mood in the country. On the Republican side, on the Democratic side, look at Bernie Sanders had millions of people who wanted to follow him down the road to his presidency. Why? Because they felt, again, that the Democratic Party institutions were not listening to them. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been as successful as he is. So somewhere, the party that you represented or the party that are represented in the United States have lost a connection. That's true for the CDU and the SPD, by the way, in Germany, I can tell you that they've lost a connection with the voters in trying to say what we say we will do and what we do we will say. And that is something that has been undercut by actions and behavior, but also by the fact that there has been an increase of impatience through the media and the instantaneous reporting on things that allow politicians zero leeway to deal with problems. And when something happens, then they get pummeled. You've probably been through that. So I suspect that the problem is going to be to reinitiate, as I just said to the colleague in the back, in the United States, a rationale for us playing the role that we do on the stage without bitching about it and without saying, why do we have to do it? There are good reasons why we have to be engaged. And there are good reasons why Britain ought to have stayed in the EU. But somebody made up balls of it in terms of describing why. And that person was the former Prime Minister of the UK. So it seems to me that the problem is going to be reinitiating a discussion with voters, all of whom are not crazy, and some of them who have a real legitimate beef. Let me just, I'm a nerd, I'm a think tank director, so I have to mention books. There's a really good
we
book.
like books here.
Yeah, I'm glad. There's a really good book called The Unwinding. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was George Packer is the author, and it's all about how the United States has been unwinding from the kind of belief and the kind of confidence in the future. And he talks to people at various different levels of society, and it's how people are getting discouraged. And I think on the one hand, you have a lot of people who are in West Virginia or in parts of the hard-hit areas of the United States who don't see themselves or their children seeing a good future ahead, and they're very discouraged by that. It's not that they hate everybody, but they just are discouraged. And on the other side, of the left side of the spectrum, there are a lot of people who are saying, you know, this whole system of government that we've set up is so lethargic, and it doesn't change, and there's so much hypocrisy, and yet, sometimes the only way you can overcome that is if there's a massive cataclysm like a war or a 9/11. Well, we don't need that. But what we do need is like you do in Europe, I think, is to have a rationale for the answers to what I always say are the 4 questions that should inform the transatlantic relationship. But that would also be true of the relationship with other countries. Where, when, how, but most of all, why do we need each other in the 21st century? And I don't think we're answering that very well. I think that's the problem we have. It's all being fragmented. And that is the seed of those people who say, well, we don't really have any interdependence anymore. We don't like interdependence. It's too damn complicated. Let's just revert to our national borders and we'll be fine. We'll build a wall with Mexico, or we'll leave the EU, or something like that. And I think that's something that really is the responsibility of people to say, there's something bigger than you here. There's something even bigger than your country here. And we had that for a long time in the United States. There was nothing that really challenged the narrative that said the U.S. has a global leadership role. And now we're seeing people say, well, maybe not. And that, I think, is the question mark that really everybody has to answer for themselves. Unfortunately, we have weak leadership in a number of places, starting in Brussels, and I think in other places as well. So it's a real challenge for a lot of people that maybe need to rethink it.
Well, on that happy note, I'm afraid we're out of time. Jack, thank you. You've terrified and informed in equal measure. And I know on election night when the networks are calling Florida and Pennsylvania and Ohio, your words will be ringing in our ears.
Well, let me leave you with one more word from a guy who I think you're familiar with, Winston Churchill. The Americans will always get it right once they've done every goddamn other thing. So, principle of hope.
Jack, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.